Welcome, everyone. This is really so great to see so many come out to celebrate teaching and learning today. I'm Mary Boyce. I'm the Provost of the university. And really, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the 7th annual celebration of teaching and learning. It's really a pleasure to be here in person. And it was about 2 years ago. In fact, when I was going around the posters remarked that there was an in-person celebration for this just 2 years ago. And so it's almost like two years and a few weeks, and here we are finally back together, able to celebrate in person. So we know that the vitality that in-person events bring to anything that we do, and having really a shared sense of purpose around how we can innovate and what we do for our students in our learning environments is another special element that we are able to bring as we work together in this great university. I'm glad to be able to greet such a vibrant community, really devoted to advancing what we do for our students, and how we can be more creative in how we create new learning environments and new ways of teaching. So we saw lots going on out there in the rotunda, and a lot of really creative new ways of doing things, from AR and VR to humanisms and cadavers. I was telling someone, I was afraid to go over to that one because it said cadaver, and then they explained what it was about, and I thought, okay, I could do that. But really is showing a lot of thought into how do we really engage our students in more meaningful ways and more creative ways, and how we're able to reach out to them. Between these presentations and the morning panel discussions, it's evident that much of our students' success is due to the dedicated community of teachers that we have here, and the spirit of innovation that you're bringing to all that you do. I also want to thank the staff of the Center for Teaching and Learning for bringing this event to fruition today, and for their ongoing work and meaningful work to really equip our faculty, our graduate student instructors, and staff alike with techniques that inspire, engage, and propel our students forward. Through activities ranging from professional development opportunities, like one-on-one consultations and group workshops, to the Provost Teaching and Learning Grants, which help faculty integrate new methods into their educational environments, the CTL seeks to foster ongoing innovation and improve learning outcomes across our campuses. It was great to see our campuses well represented in these posters. Although this event is annual, it strikes me as a particularly opportune time to gather and reflect on pedagogy and innovation. As I said, it's now more than 2 years since COVID-19 gave us a forced experiment in remote teaching, showing us that we are more nimble and more creative than we ever thought possible, and how quickly we were able to shift to a whole new mode of really engaging our students. It's now been 2 years since that transition, and now we're into our second semester where we're fully back on campus. Many of us are discovering how much the pandemic taught us about teaching and learning, and we're leveraging a broader spectrum of tools than we ever thought we would be using before. Many of you are tapping into the vitality of in-person instruction while also adding dimensions with online tools, and also changes in the learning methods that you bring to your students, and also how you engage your students, that enable new creativity and whole new forms of interactions. It's really an exciting time to come together and reflect on what we've learned, and some of the poster presentations demonstrate what creativity has been unleashed and what new doors we are opening. It's also timely because it's nearly 2 years since President Bollinger announced the institutional call for action on anti-racism. I've been very proud to see the CTL take a leading role in helping instructors put anti-racist pedagogy into action across Columbia. Today, I was thrilled to see the individual poster projects in this vein, addressing topics that range from recognizing and combating bias in patient care to promoting anti-racism in synchronous online courses. This is an area of deep importance to the university, to our students, to our faculty, to our staff. And given the great deal of work and reflection in anti-racism that is underway, I'm pleased that momentarily you will hear from Professor Frank Tuitt in his keynote, Moving Beyond Diversity to Create Anti-Racist Teaching and Learning Environments. Professor Tuitt has long been a leader in this area, and I'm grateful that he's here to speak with us this afternoon. But before I turn the program over, I'd like to compliment the individual and shared excellence of the projects on display in the poster session. Many of these projects were facilitated by Provost teaching and learning grants. And, we've got a call for proposals out there again. We're really looking forward to supporting more projects as well. And in fact, since 2014, the Office of the Provost has funded over 200 teaching and learning projects across the university. That's a pretty amazing statement, and our commitment to really help our faculty, our graduate student instructors, to really think and be able to pursue new and innovative ways to bring creativity in the learning environments which you're providing our students. So I hope you reach out to the CTL and take advantage of this opportunity. And meanwhile, we'll get on with the program. Catherine Ross, our Executive Director for the Center of Teaching and Learning, will come up to the podium here and introduce Professor Tuitt. Thank you again for all that you're doing for our students and the learning that is such an integral and key part of the mission of the university. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, for that lovely introduction and for inspiring people to apply for some of the Provost grants. The CTL would like nothing better than to help more people apply for the grants. I'm so happy to see you all here. I just can't say how thrilling it is to be speaking to a live audience. I'm very excited to present our 2022 keynote. And it's a great honor for me to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Franklin A. Tuitt. Dr. Tuitt, who has more than 2 decades of higher education administration experience, was named Vice Provost and Chief Diversity Officer at the University of Connecticut in July 2020. Prior to this move to UConn, Dr. Tuitt was a member of the University of Denver faculty since 2004, and he became their Chief Diversity Officer in 2015 and remained there until 2019. Since September 2019, he has also been a visiting scholar at the Echo Center for Diversity Policy at The Hague, Netherlands. Dr. Tuitt is the inaugural visiting scholar at the Echo Center and delivers lectures, facilitates training, and conducts research in support of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts in the Netherlands and across post-secondary institutions in Europe. In 2019, Dr. Tuitt received the National Association of Chief Diversity Officers in Higher Education Individual Leadership Award in recognition of outstanding contributions to research, administration, practice, advocacy, and policy, and whose work informs and advances understanding of diversity and inclusive excellence in higher education. So with that, I am going to turn this podium over to Dr. Tuitt.
Good afternoon. Let's try that again. Good afternoon. We're in person, aren't we? All right, good to see and feel the energy. Catherine, thank you so much for that introduction, and also wanted to thank you for the opportunity to collaborate on a variety of projects over the year. I really appreciate your commitment to creating space for critical conversations that advance diversity, equity, and inclusion, so thank you for that. It's also good to be here again in a space where I've had quite a few friends come through, whether it's to be a student here or work on the faculty. Just wanted to get a sense of if there are any folks from TC in the room, just a few hands there. So greetings to my colleagues from the education arena over there, and it's always good to be in company with you. In fact, I just learned today one of you is heading to the University of Denver, so hopefully I'm not revealing anything that hasn't been announced yet, but it was a public announcement today, so greetings there. So let's get into the presentation because I know we want to get to a conversation. What I want to do is spend a few minutes talking about how traditionally white institutions, and I frame them as traditionally white institutions because across the nation, we're seeing a lot of institutions where the demographics are shifting to the point where the majority of students in those institutions are non-white. But they remain, in terms of ethos and culture and traditions, still predominantly white, right? So, and as Provost mentioned, there's been a lot of effort to create anti-racist institutions to move the needle in that area. And what I'm going to argue basically is that how we've thought about advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion has actually contributed to some of the challenges we've seen in recent times. So that's my argument in a nutshell. Before I get to that, I did want to take a moment to acknowledge those of you in the room who have been on the front lines for advocating for more inclusive, diverse, and anti-racist institutional environments. That work is not easy work. It is one that wears on the soul, and I hope those of you who are in the struggle here are getting the support that you need. So thank you for that labor. All too often it goes unrecognized. So let's get into the talk today. So this created an opportunity for me to kind of look back at my work and how my thinking has evolved over the 2 decades I've been engaged in helping institutions create inclusive and equitable teaching and learning environments. And in 2003, we released, while I was still a student at Harvard, Realizing a More Inclusive Pedagogy, which emerged out of my dissertation. The title of the dissertation was Black Souls in the Ivory Tower, understanding what it means to teach in a manner that respects and cares for the souls of African American graduate students. And really what I wanted to do was identify best practices for creating inclusive learning environments. And as I began to share that work, I did so with the assumption that creating inclusive teaching and learning environments was the same as creating anti-racist teaching and learning environments. Right, so that was my assumption. In 2016, with my colleagues Chayla Haynes and Saran Stewart, we released Race, Equity in the Learning Environment, the Global Relevance of Critical and Inclusive Pedagogies. And the three of us wanted to trouble that assumption that creating inclusive teaching and learning environments was the same as creating anti-racist learning environments. We wanted to trouble that assumption by producing a volume that extends how the utilization of critical and inclusive pedagogies have and continue to create transformative, affirming, and equitable learning environments for all students, but especially racially minoritized students. Specifically, our hope was to provide insight into the theory, praxis, and outcomes of critical and inclusive pedagogies, and offer educators an enhanced understanding of how such models produce inclusive, engaged learning environments for all students, regardless of their racial background. Still wasn't satisfied with that. In 2018, the three of us extended that work by producing Transforming the Classroom at Traditionally White Institutions to Make Black Lives Matter. In that essay, we identify a set of principles building on our critical and inclusive work that have the potential to make Black Lives Matter in traditionally white classrooms. And we also identify several implications they have for creating racially inclusive, affirming, and equitable learning environments for all students. So you see the shift in how we're beginning to talk about this work. And then, just earlier this year, after 20 years, almost 20 years from when I began the dissertation work, I feel like my work is coming full circle. And so I released in the Journal of Minority Achievement, Creativity, and Leadership an article titled More Than a Hashtag, Nurturing Black Excellence in Traditionally White Institutions. And in the essay, I also provide some directions as to how traditionally white institutions can move away from the superficial enactment of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, and instead adopt a racial equity strategy that nurtures and values Black excellence. The genesis for this work began as I gave my last lecture at the University of Denver. So in this article I write, I have argued elsewhere where one unintended consequence of the widespread adoption of inclusive excellence and diversity on college campuses throughout the country is that it allowed institutions to move away from a focus on race and racism as a central component of our diversity and inclusion efforts. In recent years, I have become more and more suspicious of diversity and inclusion initiatives that are divorced from or in conflict with racial equity and racial justice goals. In our recently published editor volume, Plantation Politics and Campus Rebellions, Power, Diversity, and the Emancipatory Struggle in Higher Education, some of the authors argue that diversity and inclusive excellence can be operationalized in a manner of plantation politics that positions the paternalistic inclusion of Black people as a means to further the aims of white supremacy. These authors call out plantation politics in the form of people of color blindness as the dominant ideology that results in racial conflation and subsequently anti-Blackness. They warn that if we are not ultimately woke, we will continue to be seduced by inclusive excellence and diversity initiatives that reinforce white supremacy, right? It's a pretty strong shift here, right? So this image here is one example of how I did that in my own work, right? So as a part of my final lecture at the University of Denver, I used a picture to highlight that the university's diversity statement that I helped to create. So this is my work. In it, the words Black, Blackness, African American is nowhere to be found. And race only appears once. And I argue that the unwillingness to center race, much less Blackness, has directly resulted in post-racial approaches and race-neutral alternatives for framing campus diversity initiatives, right? So that's the problem. The other thing that I looked at as I was sort of exploring this in my own work is the title of my articles, which if you look at my CV, started with and built off of my dissertation work and then moved more directly into inclusive pedagogy, inclusive excellence, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there was a good reason for that, right? Those words were becoming, those concepts, those frames were becoming more palatable, right? And we started to see a much more expansive definition of diversity that moved us away from our racial justice goals, right? So even those of us who think about this on a daily basis can be complicit in the very work we're trying to dismantle and disrupt. My colleague D.L. Stewart reminds us that good intentions can produce oppressive results. DL argues that by substituting diversity and inclusion rhetoric for transformative efforts to promote equity and justice, historically white institutions have appeased their constituents and avoided recognizable institutional change. DL argues, but it is time for historically white institutions in American higher education to pursue real change and abandon the politics of appeasement. So that's the call, to really think about how we can better align our diversity and equity and inclusion goals, our commitments to inclusive pedagogy with our anti-racism goal. I think it's our failure to do that, to move beyond diversity, that has led to our inability to create anti-racist teaching and learning environments. And it has resulted in the large amounts of campus rebellions that we've seen around the globe. Unfortunately, despite our best efforts to advance diversity, post-secondary institutions around the world have found themselves in the midst of campus protests, where minoritized students and their allies have been speaking out in resistance to their daily encounters with microaggressions, macro invalidations, and not so subtle acts of discrimination. The recent student protests around the world serve as a painful reminder that though we seek to create inclusive campus environments, inclusive teaching and learning environments, our institutions and our classrooms do not flow aimlessly in space separated from a real world that can be hostile and unwelcoming. Despite our greatest desire to create inclusive teaching and learning environments that are free of racial prejudice and discrimination, where microaggressions and micro-invalidations have no home, we cannot. In a lot of my work, I argue that at the heart of the increased activism on college campuses is the failure of post-secondary institutions to create inclusive teaching and learning environments both in and out of the classroom, where minoritized students can engage in learning that suggests that their lives matter, right? The reality is that the manner in which post-secondary institutions have implemented their diversity initiatives, their teaching and learning practices, have not resulted in the substantial transformation of the day-to-day operations of campus and institutions. And in some cases, focus on how to assimilate racially minoritized students into the existing campus culture. Thus, the majority of diversity initiatives being implemented to support racially minoritized students really impact the campus systems and structures that are linked to institutional policies and practices, right? I'll say one last thing about the protests, and I shared this, I believe, the last time I was here. If you look closely at the protests and the demands that have occurred in the past 5 to 7 years, you see a couple of things. One, the revision to curriculum where topics related to race and ethnic studies and social justice are featured more and more. And so efforts to provide support in terms of funding, to redesign courses, to be critical and innovative in how we redesign our approach to teaching and learning are essential. I'll come back to that. The other piece, and I know this institution and the Center for Teaching and Learning has been at the center of this work, is its ability to provide professional development opportunities that offer diversity and inclusion and now anti-racism training, especially for faculty, right? So we need more and more of these types of initiatives if we're going to have the chance to move beyond diversity, to create anti-racist teaching and learning environments. So what is anti-racism? By now, I hope most folks are familiar with Dr. Ibram Kendi's work and have taken a position on one side or the other in terms of its importance. I think it's hard to debate that it has shaped how we think about moving forward with anti-racism work. They argue that the process of actively identifying and eliminating racism in all of its forms is what anti-racism is. The term acknowledges that simply being not racist or not participating in racism is not enough to eliminate racial discrimination. So if we were to put that into a teaching and learning context, showing up and not being racist isn't enough. In my earlier work, I would argue that we walk into a space like this and that the history of racism and oppression is embedded in the walls, in the building. And so it requires that we have to address that. We just can't enter into this space assuming that what we're doing moving forward, even if we're committed to not being racist, will address the racism that's embedded in the ethos, in the air, right? So, anti-racism is rooted in actively challenging policies, systems of beliefs and norms, I'll add, and practices, specifically pedagogical practices, that allow racism to thrive. Specifically, anti-racism refocuses our understanding of the problem from people who have malicious intent to policies and practices that bring about racial inequality. So it's asking for a much more active engagement. I was pleased to see that the Center for Teaching and Learning here has a definition of anti-racist pedagogy that drives their work. It's a paradigm located within critical theory, and I will say for me within critical race theory, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute, utilized to explain and counteract the persistence and impact of racism using praxis, right? So reflection and action as its focus to promote social justice for the creation of a democratic society in every aspect, right? And what's embedded in that definition is that we are focusing or advocating for a focus on creating anti-racist teaching and learning environments. That's not just for the benefit of racially minoritized students. When we do that, everyone in the space has the opportunity to achieve at the highest levels. So my approach, as I mentioned, it's significantly informed by critical race theory. It starts with the lived experiences of students and involves students in the analysis of their experiences to contribute to the development of a critical consciousness. So in my approach, I'm really engaging my students with a variety of pedagogical practices to develop their critical consciousness with an emphasis on them being able to develop anti-racist praxis. It also provides an opportunity where students are able to question their world with language serving as a tool. So it provides a set of frameworks and theories and perspectives that empower them to become critical agents. My approach to anti-racist pedagogy also involves creating pedagogical experiences that allow students to openly acknowledge the intersection of racism, sexism, classism, and other systems of oppression that have the potential to reinforce subordination through curricular structures and practices. Tara Yasso speaks a lot about this work, right? I'm also interested in leveraging teachable moments that force students to explore their collective lived experience in the moment and make connections between their own assumptions related to race and racism, and encourage them to explore how those assumptions can come to life in their very own discourse, right? So it requires that we're not focused exclusively on what's happening outside of the classroom, but there are valuable teachable moments that occur in the evolution of our learning experiences together in the classroom, and there are opportunities to learn and leverage those, learn from and leverage. I'm also invested in questioning dominant social discourses regarded to race and ethnicity by providing students with an oppositional or counter discourse to apply to lived classroom experiences. A key aspect of that work is allowing students to create their own narratives that enable them to hear each other's perspectives and how and in what ways race matters for them individually and collectively. So in most of my classes, and again, I'm in a space that allows me to do this in education, students will write critical racial counter-narratives, that invite them to deconstruct their lived experiences and how they've been socialized to become racial beings in whatever educational system they've been a part of. So we also create spaces for counter discourses which refute dominant expressions of truth and reality, race neutrality, and color blindness. We encourage our students to understand that racism exists every day, everywhere, both from a historical and contemporary perspective. And again, it's not just out there, it's in our institutions and in our classrooms. And finally, I use course content, assignments, and experiences to help our students see how they can become critical conscious practitioners who are capable of engaging in anti-racist practices, right? So before I get to how we sort of construct that from a conceptual perspective, I do want to acknowledge that this work is not simply something that can be downloaded from a presentation or extracted from an article or put into practice from 10 best steps to becoming an anti-racist pedagogical instructor. It's something that requires a significant amount of work, significant amount of labor, and it's a lot easier to teach from the perspective that all of our students are the same and that our spaces are free from racism. So we kept hearing in our work that this is great, you provide some guidance, you provide some direction in terms of where folks can look to find examples of this work. But what we're missing is a framework that helps us begin to provide some snapshots of what this work looks like in praxis. And so I'm working on an article with my colleague, Dr. Saran Tuitt, where we argue that there are 3 dimensions to this work, right? The first is related to anti-racist, interpersonal and interpersonal awareness, right? Regarding interpersonal awareness dimension of our proposed framework, we argue that instructors are able to demonstrate that they have successfully engaged in critical, reflective, and reflexive process that allows them to understand how their own individual, racial background, their gender, social, cultural, and privileges influence the pedagogical and curricular decisions we make. So before any of us can try to implement anti-racist pedagogy, we have to do that hard work of understanding who we are and how our lived experiences shape the ways we show up in the teaching and learning environment. That is step 1. Regarding interpersonal awareness, instructors are able to demonstrate that what they have learned about themselves, right, as personal, political, emotional, intellectual beings have contributed to their understanding of race and ethnically diverse students and the manner in which they can construct classroom learning environments that reinforce their students' humanity, right, without causing harm to the multiple interlocking aspects of their identity. The dimension on intentional praxis seeks to ascertain instructors' level of understanding of the theoretical conceptual perspectives that inform their construction of the anti-racist teaching and learning environment, with a particular focus on curricula, pedagogical decisions, and assessments they make, right? So putting together the content, the pedagogy, and the ways in which we determine learning, right? And in the third dimension, identifying affirming equity-minded instructors would have, and anti-racist instructors would have developed a mode of thinking that empowers them to call attention to patterns of racial inequity in student outcomes that exist within their areas of influence. Specifically, these instructors would be willing to take personal and institutional responsibility for the success of their students and critically reassess their own practices, exemplifying that they are race conscious and aware of the social historical context of exclusionary practices embedded in our institutions. Right? So this last dimension is about what we do with the information that we have access to. I want to drill down on this just a little bit more. Give you a few examples of what this might look like in practice. So if I was assessing how well my peers were engaged in anti-racist pedagogy, I would try to get an understanding of how they critically examine their own ideas, assumptions, and values, and how those beliefs impact their approach to teaching, their teaching philosophy, and how they evaluate students. I would also seek to understand if they developed an awareness of how their beliefs, cultures, and privileges influence the pedagogical decisions they make. And I want to see how and to what extent they are fully present in the learning environment, which in my experience requires a significant amount of vulnerability, right? And includes not just, because I think in some of my earlier versions of this work, folks started to feel, well, all you had to do was show up and talk a little bit about yourself, and then you were situating yourself in the learning environment. I would encourage you to, if you haven't, take a look at the work of Bianca Williams and Radical Honesty. It's an approach to truth-telling that allows for instructors to situate themselves in whole, authentic, and honest ways in the classroom. And it provides a way in which students are able to see a model of what it means to be fully present in a learning environment, right? Again, in the second dimension, we would look for how are you creating opportunities for interpersonal dialogue, particularly in ways that are conscious of the existence of race and racism, where multiple perspectives are honored and valued. We'd be looking for how you show students to be able to make the connections between the ideas they are learning in the classroom and how they can be applied in real world contexts, right? And then we would look to see how you understand the various ways in which your students show up in the classroom with multiple interlocking aspects of their identities that shape how they individually and collectively experience the learning environment. And then lastly, we would be looking for, and again, these are just some of the examples that we provide in this article. How are we critiquing the choices we're making about curriculum, particularly from a perspective of exposing hidden forms of oppression, and how we make appropriate changes, such as addressing things that could contribute to stereotyping, inaccurate generalizations, and historical omissions, right? We're looking for overall how you modify your curriculum and your pedagogy so that multiple identity groups are embedded into the lesson plan through inclusion of cultural histories, local histories, contributions. It's a reminder that the examples we tell when we're teaching give our students an indication of what matters, what is valued, right? And then a focus on how we think about the assessments we use and the ways that those assessments empower students to share and demonstrate their knowledge in multiple ways, right? So these are just some of the various things that we are pointing to that should be a part of the consideration as you're engaging in an anti-racist pedagogy and how you are engaging in the creation of an anti-racist teaching and learning environment. Moving to closing so we could get to some questions here. So if we're able to do all of that, we argue that you're able to recognize that race and racial equity and inclusion are central to the viability and functioning of the classroom. That faculty are adept and knowledgeable about the racial context, culture, and conditions of its client constituency, obviously students. That it ensures that faculty are aware of and knowledgeable of the centrality of whiteness and the nuances of white supremacy. and that faculty are capable of attending to race, racial equity, and inclusion within the curriculum and pedagogy with a focus on center dialogue around race and anti-racism. I'm going to come back to that in a second. Not surprisingly, I would argue that we can't create anti-racist teaching and learning environments without race-conscious leaders, right? Who are capable of comprehending the current historical context of racism in our society, who have an informed understanding of racial trauma, and are prepared to authentically engage instead of avoid emotions to start the healing process, who are capable of engaging in authentic conversations and collaborations with people of color that entail feeling and hearing and lead to action, right? Now more than ever, we need race-conscious leaders who have an informed understanding of racial trauma, who can demonstrate that they have developed an accurate understanding of racial reality, and who are prepared to boldly confront longstanding racial problems embedded in the structures of our institutions. And I will leave you with this last set of institutional and individual implications for moving beyond diversity to create anti-racist teaching and learning environments. I'm going to draw from another recent article. In the conclusion of Decolonizing Academic Spaces, Moving Beyond Diversity to Promote Racial Equity in Post-Secondary Education, Dr. Saran Stewart and I make the claim that the surge in campus rebellions occurring around the world are in part, again, the result of academic institutions to move beyond the superficial enactment of diversity and inclusion, which we argue by its design and limitations never really had a chance to facilitate equity and inclusion for racially minoritized communities. Specifically, we attribute this failure to the reluctance of higher ed institutions, in spite of our investments in DEI, to radically transform our systems and structures, leaving intact the vestiges of slavery and coloniality that continue to marginalize racially minoritized communities. As such, we hold that it is unlikely that any group of committed educators will be successful by themselves in the efforts to transform in its entirety higher education institutions that are cemented in whiteness, cemented in coloniality. However, we do remain hopeful that academic spaces within our spheres of influence can be transformed in a manner that facilitate movement beyond diversity to racial equity to racial inclusion. To that end, caring educators will want to engage in the hard work of questioning epistemological assumptions that privilege some forms of knowledge over others, reinforcing the presence of anti-colonial and anti-racist practices. Moreover, it is important for caring educators to avoid working in isolation and instead seek out opportunities to engage in dialogue with other faculty and administrators in departments and across disciplines for best approaches for transforming the academic spaces they inhabit. This is one of those spaces. Additionally, those of you who have taken on the challenge of being program leaders should explore how you can design capacity building infrastructures within and across your departments that provide opportunities for the development of anti-racist competencies necessary to transform the spaces and create anti-racist teaching and learning environments. We also need to make sure that we're incentivizing, recognizing, and rewarding those efforts. Finally, caring academics seeking to help the institutions move beyond diversity to create anti-racist teaching and learning environments will need to keep in mind that this work must be a labor of love, requiring grace, self-care, and resiliency. The academic spaces we are seeking to make anti-racist have been rooted in their whiteness and patriarchy for some time now and will not change overnight. Anti-racist learning environments anti-racist learning efforts will have to be embedded in overall institutional strategic planning efforts, where as institutions and as committed educators, we are able to demonstrate our comfort with centering anti-racist practices, our comfort in centering it in our courses, in our research, and in our service. Finally, traditionally white institutions must continue to build institutional capacity as a response to white individual and institutional fragility, right? At its core, fragility is the absence or breakdown of the social contract between historically marginalized groups and the institutions they attend. We've come to see all too often that fragile institutions lack institutional capacity and political legitimacy to navigate problematic racial climates. I'll leave you with one of my favorite quotes from Martin Luther King Jr. It sort of speaks to the urgency that I feel in our commitment to creating anti-racist teaching and learning environments. He writes, "This is no time for romantic illusions and empty philosophical debates about freedom. This is a time for action. What we need," and I'm paraphrasing here, "is a strategy for change. If we are to dismantle racism, if we are to move beyond diversity to create anti-racist teaching and learning environments, we must establish a new anti-racist ground. I believe events like this, commitments like this, give us a good chance at that. And I hope that we're committed to continuing to engage in efforts that lead to a new starting point. That is the challenge that I hope you all continue to take up. And that is the challenge that I'm committed to addressing. And I'll close with, in honor of Bell Hooks, that all of this work, for me, creates opportunities for us and our students to engage in education as the practice of freedom. Thank you. We'll take some questions. Great. Yes.
So you mentioned that sort of.
Hold on one second.
Yes, we want everyone to use a microphone, please.
Got it. First of all, thank you very much. You mentioned that campus diversity and inclusion initiatives have kind of replaced the language of race with other types of language, and that you argued, I think that's actually sort of obfuscation, that's problematic. But I'm curious what you think about the terms, the specific terms black and white, as words for describing people. Because I think there are terms that we all kind of casually accept as reasonable words to use to describe people, but maybe they don't actually hold up to much scrutiny, because not only do they imply the existence of racial categories, they imply the existence of a racial binary, that there's two kinds of people that are opposite of one another. So I'm just curious what you think about those particular terms, whether we should continue to use them, whether we should try to find a new language for race. Again, within the framework of saying that we need language for race rather than just language for diversity and inclusion.
Yeah. My thinking about language has changed dramatically as I've engaged more parts of the world. And so I'll remind us that context matters deeply. And in an ideal world, yes, we would move away from binary terms that don't fully capture the complexity and diversity of humanity. But to do so in a space that has such a strong historical connection also runs the risk of enacting violence in ways we can't imagine. And so as we think about moving away from language, to find more innovative ways of creating anti-racist teaching and learning spaces, we have to be careful in the terms we use. And we have to be willing to let our students inform how and the various ways in which they want to be identified. So yes, And we also need to be careful in the ways we do that.
Hi, Dr. Tuitt. I'm Victoria Mullaney Brown. I work at Columbia College in Columbia Engineering. So first off, thank you so much for coming and presenting your work. I was here 2 years ago when you presented previously. So it's nice to see you back on campus. All of the things that you pointed out as far as action steps and what we can do next made me think about my undergraduate experience at Skidmore College, where I was part of the Intergroup Dialogue program. Everything you talked about, their critical consciousness, the ways in which you have students write counter narratives, to me just like yelled in my brain. Intergroup dialogue as a tool, as a way of teaching and learning, it's been tested and proven that people really get a lot out of that learning experience, both at the faculty level, the undergraduate level. They've seen it done in corporate environments. And so for me, when I think about a dream position and the place of privilege that we sit on as Columbia administrators or faculty or staff, I think there's a real opportunity to think about intergroup dialogue as a mechanism or as a mode of teaching and learning, because it gets at the historical pieces that you're talking about, the language. Because when I started, I went to a historically white institution, I had no way to talk about my racial identity or situate myself in the context of American histories at all, or the global world. And so I think about that in the context of the lived students that we have walking across our campus from so many places. And to me, I feel like intergroup dialogue would be an amazing opportunity to present that. And I know there's a little bit of history here with intergroup dialogue at Columbia, but it's not actively happening. So I propose that as an option, but I also welcome your thoughts to think about, what do you think about intergroup dialogue? Do you think it's a good way to move us forward?
Yes, thank you for that. Absolutely, dialogue is an essential component of anti-racist pedagogy. And I'll offer a couple of reasons why. As you suggested, engaging in dialogue gives you an opportunity to not only share a little bit about yourself, but contribute to your own understanding and others about your lived experiences, right? And so there are a variety of dialogue type initiatives, whether it's structured dialogue, intergroup dialogue, deliberative dialogue. There's just so many different approaches to it. And absolutely, dialogue has to be an essential component. The last thing I'll say about dialogue is the act of speaking allows you to breathe, to be physically present in the space, right? And it gives us a chance to see and feel the humanity of our students. It also can be a very stressful thing to facilitate and to participate in. And so again, we got to be careful and prepared. I've seen more good intentions go bad by simply initiating dialogue and exiting the space, right? So if we're going to facilitate, we got to be prepared to model. We got to be prepared to disrupt. And we got to be prepared to show the knowledge that comes from that. So I'm heavy on dialogue, but we also have to create other ways for folks to engage. There's a lot of real creative work happening around blogs and using social media and just using different ways of activating the thinking in our students. So dialogue's a part of it. It shouldn't be the only part.
I just want to thank you again for bringing this conversation to us. We heard you a couple of years ago, right before almost the pandemic, and here you are opening up after for us. Want to explore critical mass with you, because it didn't spend much time on this. Can an individual have impact in this work? Do you require a movement in order to move anti-racist pedagogy forward? Just like to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you for that question, and good to see you again. So yes, we need folks to start with themselves and the spaces that they control, but that can't be the only areas of innovation It has to be supported at departmental level. We're having experiences right now in my own institution where students experience the commitment to anti-racist pedagogy in one class, and then the following class experience the exact opposite, right? And so that creates a shock, right? That creates some friction for our students. So we have to do this at the departmental level. We have to figure out how to, Catherine and I were talking about this the last time we had our conversation, there you go, about how we need to make sure that the systems and structures that reward faculty for doing this work count, right? So whether it's promotion and tenure, whether it's merit, we need to figure out. And that I've come to understand, unfortunately, having worked for a variety of leaders, if we don't have commitment from the top, our efforts can not be sustained. And so it has to happen at an institutional level. In my role, we're trying to do it at a system level across multiple institutions. So it has to happen in a variety of ways, and it can't. We have to stop depending on the few minoritized faculty who have committed their careers to doing this work to do all of that labor on their own. So yes, we have to get a critical mass of folks engaged in this movement, and we have to design ways that incentivize and reward their participation in this movement. In the back, yes.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated this talk, and I think this sort of follows on the previous question. But I was wondering if you could say a little more about the place of what we're doing in the classrooms and how that interacts with the students' experience in the institution at large, especially with whether the institutional structures are like materially supporting these students or materially disadvantaging these students. I was just curious if you could speak a little more to that.
Yeah, I'm going to attempt to answer the question this way, and you can let me know if I'm not getting directly to it. One of the things that I didn't mention in my presentation is the need for us to be able to empirically show that what we're doing is making a difference, right? And my suggestion is that we point to institutional data. We look at learning outcomes. We look at data related to achievement. And we stop pointing the finger at our students and start looking at the institution that's creating the inequities that we see, right? So we're having a conversation at my institution now. We had it at the University of Denver about why we continue to see persistent gaps in graduation rates and persistence rates between our racial and ethnic minorities, minoritized students. And I'm amazed that we still see narratives and discourses that blame students who we recognize as being capable of learning as the problem, right? And I'm not saying it's as simple as saying faculty are the problem, but we do have some antiquated ways in which we construct our teaching and learning environment. We do have still too many folks who teach in the ways that they were taught. We still have outdated content. There's so many different ways. And the good thing is we're seeing a lot of support externally now, whether it's the National Science Foundation, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. There are just so many different structures and funding agencies that are providing resources for us to think in new, innovative, critical ways that align with our anti-racist efforts. But if what we're doing is not changing those outcomes, those inequities that we're seeing, we got to try something else, right? So hopefully that got at that question. Yes.
A lot of what you spoke about reminds me of this quote from Jimi Hendrix. When the power of love overcomes the love of power, right, the world will truly know peace. And you spoke a lot about vulnerability and caring, and I think at the center of this work is caring and love. And I guess my question for you is like, for people who benefit and really profit from this culture of domination and disrespect, you know, how can we lead them toward love?
How can we lead them to love? So I have a couple of immediate reactions to that. I think the last time I was here, I shared a quote that I had used previously about for our racially minoritized students coming to institutions like ours is like looking for love in all the wrong places. And at a deep level, I often wonder, are we asking our institutions to do something that they're just not capable of doing? And I get in that sort of tunnel, and my hope starts to wane, and I'm like, why am I doing this? And then I go to class, and I see the light bulbs go on, and I see how the learning environment that we created is actually allowing our students to experience what it feels like to be loved and validated and nurtured, right? And though that's temporary, it has the potential to unleash their emancipatory imagination, right? And so you're absolutely right. We need to figure out and align our anti-racist efforts with how we love our students through teaching and learning, through the construction of spaces that lift up their sense of self, their ability to be change agents, their ability to dream the impossible, right? That's how we create love through anti-racist pedagogy, right? How do we convince folks? You know, Paulo Freire would suggest that it is the responsibility of the oppressed to restore to the oppressor their humanity. I might extend that to, and it's hard, trust me, that we got to figure out how we can love our folks who are standing in our way of being the best versions of ourselves, right? And their ability to experience that, I think, has the potential to shift how they approach their work. It's not easy, but the more we can empower our students and ourselves to do that, I talk about grace, all right? The more we can have grace for each other and ourselves, because we're gonna fail in our attempts to do this. I've been thinking about this for over 20 years, and I still get it wrong from time to time, right? But having grace for myself and for my colleagues and for the institution, though that becomes harder and harder, is something we gotta do. We good? Thank you all.
Thank you so much for the inspiration. It is sorely needed. We really can't thank you enough. Thank you all for coming today and for the questions and the conversation that we had. We welcome your feedback on this session, and we would love to hear from you. We hope to have more of these conversations. We do have one more conversation planned for April 27th with Dr. Asao Inoue, who will be doing a remote workshop on how to work with feedback and assessment in anti-racist ways. So I want to just give Dr. Tuitt another round of gratitude. And if you want to hear more about his thinking, we have a podcast. So he did a podcast conversation with me a few weeks ago, and it's out, our Dead Ideas in Teaching and Learning podcast, so you can get more inspiration from Dr. Tuitt. Thank you all so much.